The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your co-hosts, Melissa Miller. I'm a freelance science writer and have a couple articles recently in Star Wars Insider magazine.
And I'm your other co-host, James Floyd. I also do freelance writing for Star Wars Insider magazine and StarWars.com. I am the author of the now out book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. Today, we are going to be talking about geology and paleontology of Galaxy's Edge and other Disney park areas. We have a special guest today. His name is Garrett Vice, and he is a geologist, and he recently gave a tour at Disneyland, California on the geology and paleontology of the Disney parks. So welcome, Garrett.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes, we're excited to have you, and I'm still kicking myself for not just coming to the Disney parks and following you around while you were in town recently for the Geological Society of America conference.
Yeah, it's pretty cool that Southern California has such a diverse geological history. And of course, nowhere is that more apparent in the developed fake sculptures of Disneyland.
Yeah, exactly. Quickly, before we get into all of it, we've had a couple geology, paleontology episodes previously because we just keep loving this subject and finding all sorts of cool Star Wars nerds that talk about it. But tell us a little bit about what geology covers and paleontology covers, and a little bit more about what you study.
Yeah, great question. So I've been a geologist for around 20 years now as a professional geologist. As part of that adventure, I've worked everything from private corporations to working for state surveys. And I've done everything from paleontology to studying geologic hazards to studying geothermal energy. So I've ran the whole gamut. Geology really is the study of the earth. And more than that, it's really the study of how we live with the earth and what we use within the earth. So many folks think of geology as, I'm just going to study a bunch of rocks, which yes, we do, but it's even above and beyond that. It's not just studying the rocks, but it's learning what can we do with those rocks. So nice examples of that, of course, gold and silver and now lithium, right? So all things that we use every day. And it takes geologists to go find all of those things, even things as simple as where do we get the lime for concrete, right? So geologists are out mapping and finding those deposits. So that's what a geologist does, right? We study the earth, we find these resources, and then we learn how to use these resources with engineers. Paleontologists study ancient life. And so as we're going through today, I'm going to be bouncing between those two subjects. Geologists and paleontologists work hand in hand. They're really commingled together. One needs to understand the other to be successful. And really, we all consider ourselves earth scientists. That's one of the things I love about geology, and I often tell people is that you have to learn a lot about a lot of different things because we're all trying to solve puzzles. I always talk about being like a Sherlock Holmes, right? Or I always think geologists, potentially all of us would be in CSI if we weren't geologists because we like trying to find a problem and solve it, right? We only have limited amounts of data, right? We have a bone here or we have a rock here, and these things don't exist everywhere. So we need to understand where they exist and why.
Wow, I can dig it.
Oh, that's good, James. So how did you first get into Star Wars and the Disney parks?
Yeah. Oh, geez. Star Wars from very, very young age. I remember going to see Return of the Jedi in the movie theater. That's the first thing I remember. My parents told me they took me when I was really young to see Empire Strikes Back. I don't remember that. I actually got really into, with some friends, the role-playing game of Star Wars in the 90s.
Oh,
and
awesome.
So a group of folks who had actually, there's, of course, other role-playing games. Most people know D&D, but Star Wars had a version. I don't know if it's still around today, but they had a role-playing version back in the 90s, and I would play with some friends.
I want to play that.
The old West End Games D6 system, I'm
Yes,
presuming?
exactly. The D6 system. Exactly
That
right.
is still around. I actually played a session of that at the Origins Game Fair last summer, that there's a group that still keeps that D6 system still alive.
Oh my gosh, I want to do this very bad now. We need to bring it back. Let's pitch that for celebration, just a game room of D&D.
That'd be awesome. I think I embody all things that are kind of fun that way and, kind of all things that we call geekdom, I guess. But I really got into Star Wars through that, for the Return of the Jedi, and then through playing that. And then from there, I grew up as a Disney kid. My dad went to Disneyland opening day back in 1955. My mom went, opening month or two. I grew up down there. Every year in my stocking, I would get a bus pass and an annual pass to Disneyland.
Wow.
Oh.
We'd hop the bus and then go there. And as I got older, friends would drive us. I spent a lot of time within the park, specifically Disneyland, and it's always been near and dear to my heart. So you start bringing Star Wars now, and you have Disney. And of course, with Galaxy's Edge, that's where the two merge. And that's what was really exciting about when that park was open there in 2019. I was super excited about it.
Nice.
Well, let's just talk Galaxy's Edge. That Black Spire outpost obviously has the Black Spires. Take us into that.
It's really a story of, I'll really say 5 elements as far as the story of how Disney came, or at least I think Disney came to build Galaxy's Edge. So let me have this caveat and this disclaimer up front is, in science, we have hypotheses, right? Again, we look at a bunch of observations and then we come up with a story, right? And there's clearly a story that's happened on Batu. And I was lucky enough to go visit Batu a couple times and talk to even some of the locals and try to understand this story. Now, taking a step back out of Batu, the world of Imagineers, we haven't got a yes, that's a story, or no, that's not the story. But I'll tell you the story that we came up with and we think that kind of happened. And it goes like this. So we have to take a step back to a couple different times. One is over 200 million years ago. We're going to talk about a time 35 million years ago. We're going to talk about a time about 2,000 years ago. And then we're going to talk about a time about 70 years ago. So let me start with the 70 years ago first. And that is that Walt and Lily Disney were on a trip. And they were on a trip to Colorado for their anniversary in 1956. And when they went on that trip in 1956, they went to a place called Pikes Peak. And now this is now Florissant National Monument. And there, Walt, is kind of a joke, bought a piece of petrified wood. And it was actually a petrified stump. And it's now sitting in Disney. So you can go to Disneyland around Rivers of America. And it's jokingly called the oldest attraction in all the Disney parks, right? Because it's 35 million years old.
This was at a time you could just buy a giant petrified stump. Can you still do that?
That's a good question. Not from there, right? You can't do it from there. And I would suggest people probably don't do that because those are really fascinating to have in place and understand for scientists to study them. But at that time, yes, it was a different time. He was able to buy that. And then, of course, there's a plaque at the park where Lily says, she donated it to Disneyland. Although the story goes, I think Walt actually bought it for Disney and it was an ongoing joke. That was her wedding present. But she said it didn't fit on the mantle. So she had to donate it to the park, right? So that's kind of a fun story that's out there in legend. And
I do feel like one of the traditional anniversary gifts is wood. So I wonder now, petrified wood, 5 years anniversry.
It's right. Both wood and stone.
Right, exactly.
You kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right?
Yeah, I like
So what does that have to do with the story of Galaxy's Edge? Well, it turns out that how the stump that was fossilized came to be is very similar to the story I think that's happening at Galaxy's Edge. So what's that story? So the reason we have a fossilized stump, so the bottom part of the tree, is pretty unique. So most of the time when we think about fossilized wood or petrified wood, we think of things like Petrified Forest National Park. That takes me to the 200 million year old piece of the story. And that is the Imagineers absolutely pulled from that park. And they've even said, if you watch on Disney Plus, their Galaxy's Edge, their launch that Neil Patrick Harris hosted, which was really interesting, but they talk about it very briefly that, they took some of their inspiration from there. Those logs, however, are generally lying on their side, and you don't see the stump preserved. So you have a very special geologic environment where you can get that preservation of that stump, and you can actually preserve trees standing upright. It's not how we really think about trees as they die. We expect them to fall over. However, the stump was upright. And then again, of course, we'll talk about Galaxy's Edge for a second here. All those spires are upright petrified trees. Right. And so all those spires are supposed to be giant, petrified, ancient trees. Now, again, if we think about that kind of world, it takes a very specific and special geologic environment to have them, first of all, to preserve them in the first place, and even more of a specialized series of events to actually have them petrified, standing straight up. So really fascinating. Now, going back to the story with Lily and Walt Disney, that's from Florissant National Park, which was a place where those trees were deposited or preserved about 35 million years ago. And the process that did that was actually a series of large volcanoes. And we see something similar. People are familiar with Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, right? So you can think of these big volcanoes. We call them stratovolcanoes. When they erupt, they have these big mud flows that come down the sides of them. We call them lahars. And these lahars come through and they can actually bury trees. Some trees they'll knock down. Some will actually bury the bottoms of the trees and actually can try to preserve them. Scientists think that's one way you can preserve these base of trees. So it's going to take a very large volcanic event that has a lot of mud and ash and debris rolling down the side of one of these mountains through one of these valleys. In this case, of Florissant. There's actually an ancient valley they call Florissant, and there's actually a lake there. And that's how they think these old, basically sequoias or redwoods were preserved. I think, and this is, again, I haven't been able to double check this with the Imagineers, so any Imagineers listening, please let us know, is that I'll call it the lily tree, right, at Disneyland is one of those that was preserved by one of those lahars and actually preserves the basal section of that petrified tree. Now, what's neat about that is when you go to Galaxy's Edge, all those big spires, right, are big petrified trees. And if you get up close to some of them, you can actually see that same root structure in the base. So next time you go to Disneyland, take a look, you'll actually see the base of the stump. And you can actually see that in Galaxy's Edge. The Imagineers recreated that. And so it's pretty phenomenal.
I've been a couple of times out of Galaxy's Edge, and I definitely spent a lot of time looking at things, but I definitely haven't noticed any root structures. Wouldn't have come up with the petrified tree thing. I was definitely thinking of it more like hoodoos aren't quite right either. That's like in Bryce, because those are like sort of rock piles, but, are almost like stalactites, whichever ones go up, like, crustified mud almost more. What were you thinking, James?
Thinking more lava plugs or something where it was something built up on the inside that was much harder, it was the black stone of some kind, and then everything else eroded away, and we've got these spires sticking up that were basically the cast molds of the inside of a volcano. But the petrified tree concept is also really cool because it's like, these things are really, really tall. So imagine what type of mud flow or sediment flow rapidly buried them, and how tall are these trees, and yet they all still stayed up. These things were kind of like mega redwoods.
Cool. Yeah, I love our two different layman perspectives being different. And we clearly know some terms and some ways that something like this could form.
I'm truly impressed that you're thinking about this. But again, this is part of going after the story a bit. And actually, the Imagineers left clues around. So at least at Disneyland, right before you go into the Rise of the Resistance there, if you're going towards the line on the right-hand side, there's a little kiosk that sells things. If you look, there's a big tubular feature, and you can see where the Imagineers even created like a little bit of a ring structure and bark structure. It looks just like a log you'd see as a picture. In fact, you can lay down a picture from Petrified Forest National Park and lay it down next to that. Other than these things are, multiple times larger than what we're seeing. The other clues they left there is, at least at Disneyland, I haven't checked at Disney World, but where the X-Wing is, right by that Rise of the Resistance entrance, if you take a look at the rocks there, you'll see this jumble of rocks. And most people probably look at that and go, what is this? There's big rocks and the kind of tan stuff in between. This is a recreation of what we call a lahar, or one of these mud flows. In fact, we talked about this during the field trip. You can actually lay down a picture of a lahar next to the picture of that feature right around the X-Wing. And you can't tell the difference which one's real and which one's not. These two pictures, right? Obviously, if you walk up to it, you can tell. So the Imagineers left a lot of stories there and left a lot of clues to, I think, what they were trying to get at. Now, I mentioned there was kind of 5 of these things that really help with the story, right? We talked about this idea of petrified wood being there. We talked about Petrified Forest National Park. We talked about Florissant National Park. We can also talk about a place called Specimen Ridge, which is another one of these areas associated with Yellowstone, which erupted right around 50 million years ago. There was a series of forests that were in place, and these volcanoes buried those as well. Look up Specimen Ridge, you'll see these long, tall trees that are still in place with the roots, again, very similar to Florissant National Park, which may be another similar type of inspiration, or somewhere else we see on Earth what they're seeing in Batu. The last one I'll say is there's a story here from 79 AD. So what happened in 79 AD here on Earth was Mount Vesuvius, Pompeii. And next time you ride Rise of the Resistance, when you're going through the queue, pay attention to the walls. You'll see clay pots in the walls and other human artifacts. Well, I'll say human, whatever.
Right.
But you actually see them buried in ash, just like Pompeii, and you can actually see those in the Rise of the Resistance line. Yet again, another clue is being left to tell this story.
And those look realistic to the way that archaeological artifacts were found in Pompeii.
Good question. And I'm not familiar enough with Pompeii to answer with any kind of confidence, but I'd say there's clearly an influence there based on the pictures I've seen in things like National Geographic, or, when you go to a museum and see a tour of it, it looks similar. I don't know how close they are and they've been replicated that way, but so cool. It's pretty cool to see. Yeah, it's awesome.
And it's one of those things I realize, this is true at Disneyland, right? Sometimes you actually regret not waiting an hour or two in line because there's always so much to see, right? It's the same with, particularly I think about it when I'm in Tower of Terror, which is now the Guardians of the Galaxy ride, because there's so much to see in that hotel lobby. But if you get a fast track or whatever, you just skip right through it. And so I think the only times I've been on Rise of the Resistance, I've paid that extra, genie fee and not waited in the line. So I'm not sure I'm willing to wait for 2.5 hours to see Pompeii jars, but maybe I am. If you're with me and talking about geology the whole time, I would do that.
I got a question about the lahars. How can you tell those as lahars as opposed to something that was much more slowly deposited with sedimentary layers like a sandstone, or even an underwater sand rock slide or something that builds up quickly? Yes, that was the word I was about to say.
What was the word? I didn't hear it.
Turbidite. So that's basically an underwater flow, if you will. And so how do we know the difference? Is a couple things. We can look at what's made up of the lahars and actually what's in the muds and what the rocks are composed of, right? So we can often tell, especially when we get under a microscope, we'll do what are called thin sections. We'll take rock samples, we'll cut the thin sections, and we can take a look at what that material is made up of. We can also look at the overall material package. So what are we going to expect to see in a lahar, right? We're going to see a lot of things related to volcanics. We're going to see volcanic debris. We'll see ash, right? That's been solidified and it has a certain texture and look to it. We're also going to see something that's very chaotic. It's not going to be very well organized. One thing about the turbidites is they're not always, but they can be well organized. Usually lahars are not well organized. We say that in geology, we call them poorly sorted. You're going to have rocks and debris of all different types. They're going to be very angular. They're not going to be rounded like you think of in a stream. And so you start, again, I'll go back to CSI, right? You're going to take a look at all these features and go, okay, what could this tie back to? What's this criteria to make something like this happen? And the other part of this is we'll put it together with the regional story. So there's very few times that I know of that a geologist or even a paleontologist will go out and just look at one layer. We're going to look at the stuff below. We're going to look at the stuff above. We're going to look at the stuff miles away, right? We're going to start putting that story together in a much larger region so we can ask ourselves, does this make sense? And so if we find lots of evidence of other kinds of volcanic features, right, we see lava flows or we see ashfall or what we call tuffs, we can start putting that story together and say, okay, it makes sense that this is a lahar that we're seeing coming through here. Good question.
So how did the field trip go at the conference? Did people enjoy it? How many people showed up? How'd it go?
The field trip was amazing, and it was really made possible because I had a great team around me. I had Dan Sturmer from the University of Cincinnati, Michelle Mary from Cal State Fullerton, and Stuart Sumida, who you had on this program before, from Cal State San Bernardino. And the four of us led the field trip looking at the sites around the Disneyland park. We ended up putting the first field trip together and it filled up within, I don't know, a very short period of time, 24, 48, I don't remember how many hours. It was very quick, right? We weren't sure how people were going to think about this because how often do people think about geology and paleontology and think about an amusement park? But it turns out Disneyland as a whole has done a great job creating this world of fantasy. And what helps create that world of fantasy is what you put around it. In this case, a lot of times the geology and paleontology. When you walk into Batu, if you realize it or not, the background, right, is just awe-inspiring. The first time I walked in there, I looked at those big spires and I thought, this is amazing. I feel like I am somewhere else, right? But those are based on geologic principles. I go on Big Thunder Mountain, right? Wow, I'm running through the Wild West, but I'm in Anaheim or I'm in Orlando, right?
Right.
And so they do a really good job incorporating the geology into this. But we didn't know how folks were going to think about that and going on the actual field trip. But it turned out we ended up doing 2 field trips because the first one filled up so quickly. We did a second one as well, and both went really, really well. We worked our way through the park. We always know there's going to be a hiccup somewhere. There's always something down. In this case, the Disneyland Railroad was down, which we were really because the Disneyland Railroad takes you through the Grand Canyon and through the time of the dinosaurs, which if folks haven't been to Disneyland to do that ride alone, it's pretty phenomenal and a lot of fun. So we had to adjust. And actually, one of your other guests you've had on here, Dr. Stewart, right, that was on here and talked about paleontology with you all before, was one of the other field trip leaders on that. And that was the one that he was going to lead. And they were like, oh, the train's down, right? What do you do? We had a really good time. We were able to talk a lot about how you can look at geologic principles and use what the Imagineers did across the park. Now, this becomes especially true when we get to Galaxy's Edge as well. In fact, we built up a story to that point. Galaxy's Edge was our very last stop. And we made a bunch of observations along the way, including visiting the lily petrified tree, taking a look at the layers and talking about the geology at Big Thunder Mountain. Also, we talked about Matterhorn. We talked about Pirates of the Caribbean and the idea of caves and cave formation. Yeah. So we had a lot of fun. We took some folks on the Rivers of America paddle boat and talked about what was happening there. And so really a lot of fun and a lot of background information. And then when we got them to Galaxy's Edge, we had them make a lot of observations about what they think could be happening and then talk through what they thought about that. You know, we pointed out these observations. Okay, you have these things that look like lahars. Oh, you have these big pillar things that have fallen over that look like they have something similar to bark and have this color on the inside that looks like petrified trees. What do you think? You have these big spires that are popping out of the ground. What do you think those could be? And so we'd have that conversation, do a bit of critical thinking along the way. And it seemed to go very well. So I was very happy with it. One of the best moments is, at least at Disneyland, there's a point where you're kind of transitioning from the market and you're going towards the Resistance Outpost. And right there's a door. And we were standing in front of that. And who walks out but Chewie? And I'm presenting, and Chewie stops, turns around, and starts listening to me, and then starts debating with me about the geology and Wookiee. And it was one of the great, we couldn't have paid for a better moment, right? I mean, all the folks involved, we had groups of people starting to get around us. We're like, oh, hey, try not to create a distraction, but it was really neat. So finally, he and I were arguing, and then somebody reminded me, you don't argue with a Wookiee. And I told him, I want to keep my arms. You're right.
Yeah. Well, and so it might be that you have all your answers, right? Chewie told you the whole backstory, and
right.
You just didn't have anyone there to translate.
That's okay. I needed a translator.
Yeah.
Where's Han when I need him?
Right.
So, yeah, it was a lot of fun. Actually, the other neat thing that happened there. So one of the things we always do before we go on one of these field trips is we always go out and spend some time walking the trip, understand the logistics, and really seeing if the story we put together makes sense. But what was great is while we were there visiting Batu, some of the local Batuans came out and talked to us about the legend and the history of those features. And what was really neat about that is we didn't know all this at the time, but the story we had put together fits perfectly with their story. And actually, we were able to fill in part of the story that they didn't understand about the large volcanoes and about the ancient civilization that disappeared by looking at what was in, the Rise of the Resistance queue. And that was really neat. But they told us a story about there were sentient trees. So these were old sentient trees that were there. And then there were ancient people that came there. And then there was some kind of conflict. And, then there was a big apocalyptic event that happened, i.e. some kind of major volcano that would have dwarfed something like Mount St. Helens today, right? If you think about the sheer volume of material to bury the bottom part of 100 feet of a tree, right? Or 80 feet of a tree. And so it was really neat talking to them and having them help put that story together, specifically about the fact that they said, yeah, we believe these are ancient sentient trees that now are, obviously long extinct. So I thought that was a really neat side story as well.
Oh, cool.
So you would say they're kind of sentient.
Nice.
A little Lord of the Rings here.
Yeah. I was wondering, would a lightsaber cut through one of these spires? If it's like fossilized tree, how hard is it?
So can lightsabers cut through rock? That would be my question back to you.
Let's see. They can cut through metal doors. If you drop them on the floor, I assume they just keep falling down through. I think that might be in like the Family Guy episode, though, or Robot Chicken.
We do see Rey slice through the Wailing Woman rock on Acto.
Right.
Good job making the fish ladies happy. I think that you could easily use a lightsaber to do a lot of geologic cross-sectioning.
It would be a great way to open up geodes.
Right. Okay. No, there you go. I love it. We have the answer.
Yeah, I would say for those High Republic fans, we mean Geode, the rock thing, and not Geode, the character. Please do not open up Geode, the character.
Oh, no. I'm curious if you also went over to California Adventure while you were in town. I love that park. And if there's anything geological you can tell us about Cars Land.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, we can know we're talking Star Wars, but yes, absolutely. So one of the coolest things that, again, I credit to the Imagineers. What an amazing group of individuals building stuff there. And they've actually recreated a national park brochure pamphlet talking about the geology of Cars Land, which is
Cool.
pretty phenomenal. You probably look it up online. I'm sure somebody's posted it somewhere. So from Radiator Springs Racers, if you head towards the archway going towards San Francisco, there is a part where you can pull off the pathway, and they actually recreated this amazing national park flyer. It looks just like you get if you went to Yellowstone or Yosemite. And what's great about it is that the Imagineers put this into the world of cars. So a great example of that is they talk about how these formations came to be. And there's this concept of plate tectonics, and we call these continents move around continental drift. So the Imagineers put a spin on that and called it Lincoln Continental Drift. So they have all kinds of fun names for the different features. They really take a cross section from the Grand Canyon and change all the names, right? Mm-hmm. And actually in the talk I gave, one of the things I talked about was using that area to help students of all ages, from brand new to earth sciences to college age, to think about geology in a different way and think about the principles of geology, like original horizontality, the idea that rocks are laid flat. Or even there, we all know Radiator Springs grew up around a spring, right? Mm-hmm. This is an artesian well. And we can even talk about this idea of how does the water flow in the subsurface, and what are aquifers, what are aquicludes, right? You can have all these conversations with students. And so there's a lot to see there. But yeah, they did a phenomenal job. I'm really curious. They clearly pulled from a couple different areas. Parts of the area look very similar to places like Capitol Reef National Park. Clearly, they're along the Colorado plateaus where they're pulling a lot of this information from as far as like a geologic province. But I'd be really curious to talk to the Imagineers who created, one, to give them a huge pat on the back of what a phenomenal job. But two, to understand exactly where were their influences, what were the pictures that they used, or where did they go visit out in the field to get this idea of building this world that they build there, which is, again, it's really phenomenal what they've done. And you can cover most geologic topics between the two parks, which is pretty amazing as well, right? We can talk about sedimentary rocks, right? So things like even Galaxy's Edge, we can talk about fossilization there. You can talk about volcanoes there. The one that gets a little tougher probably is metamorphic rocks, which are rocks that have changed through heat or pressure. But you can be creative and talk about that with things like the Matterhorn at Disney Park. Clearly, sedimentary rocks are the key component for Cars Land. So you can think of sand and mud and limestone, and that's really what they're basing that whole land off of. So you can get into that as well. So yeah, Cars Land's amazing. I can't say enough fun things. I always make sure I go on the ride. It's fun.
I was wondering when you were talking about metamorphic rock, I don't know if it fits the definition, but I was thinking like in Pirates, because you mentioned, I hadn't even thought of Pirates of the Caribbean as being a geologic feature, but are like gemstones, right? Like is all their treasure and stuff like that? Is that also something you have insights as a geologist?
Great question. Yes. So one of the things geoscientists do is it's part of our job to find those things, right? There's a whole group of geologists that go out there to look for gold and silver and rare earths and emeralds and rubies and diamonds, right? All those things that are from the earth we look for. And those occur a lot of times as metamorphic byproducts. Sometimes they're igneous. And so you can find them in different ways. Thinking about Pirates of the Caribbean, the gems. The other thing on Pirates of the Caribbean I think about is just the karst topography and the idea you have cave systems, right? And I think that's a really interesting subject as well. One of the reasons for the field trip, we actually went on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and we actually took all the participants on it so we can talk about going through the cave system on the first part of the Pirates ride, and then talk about the idea stalactites, stalagmites. And then we also talked about that going through Big Thunder Mountain as well, because the first part of Big Thunder Mountain at Disneyland has a beautiful cave system, right? You only get to see it for about 3 seconds before you start screaming, but you can see it. Right. And then you take off and go flying around and you never see it again. But it's some nice examples. Again, back to the Imagineers and the creativity of the Disney folks creating these amazing worlds using earth science topics. So really, really neat. That's one thing that would be neat. You know, the one thing I didn't notice, I always wonder if, they could have incorporated some more cave type features within Batu and Galaxy's Edge, but I don't know if they had the right environment, limestone, created to do it.
Well, so I was thinking with going on pirates, they had a lot of gold treasure there, but if they had a lot of fool's gold, would that be pyrite of the Caribbean?
It would be the pyrite of the Caribbean. That's right. On it today. So okay, I got to tell you my favorite one for my daughter. What do you call a pile of kittens?
Okay. I don't know.
A mountain. There you go. My geology joke I use for the kiddos when I go present there. So
I was going to say, since you mentioned, being a dad and excellent dad joking, I'm curious if this is something you can turn off, or is like every trip everywhere about the geology?
So my family has a saying, watch the road, not the rocks. And I'm pretty sure they invented rumble strips for geologists. So when we're traveling, safety is always first. So let me say that. But it doesn't mean that I don't really enjoy what I see around me. And we don't make stops along the way to go check out the rocks. And I take the family, of course, with me. I'm sure they get tired of hearing me talk about geology, even at Disney, right? I mean, we walk around Disney and I talk about, where's the Matterhorn, Switzerland? Let's talk about what that is. Or Big Thunder. Oh, Big Thunder is based on Bryce Canyon National Park, right? Let's talk about that. Or Galaxy's Edge. Check out these giant petrified trees. Next time we drive on Route 66, let's go check out petrified, national forest. And so, no, I don't turn it off. That's the interesting thing about a lot of geoscientists in general and paleontologists is that we don't only do it as careers, but we do it because we love it and we're passionate about it. I mean, I am a geologist. It's not just what I do for work. It's one of my hobbies. Obviously, I have a few. I mentioned a few already, but it's something I will do forever. I mean, I will until I can't anymore. I will go look at rocks. I will go collect rocks. I will go out and try to understand, what am I seeing here? What's the story? The downside sometimes is you go places like Zion National Park or the Grand Canyon, which are awe-inspiring, but I see the awe and then my mind immediately goes to, okay, how did this form? And I actually, almost like a motion picture, I kind of see it through time of what's going on. So it takes some of the awe away, but it's also very exciting to do as well. And I know lots of other geoscientists that are the same way. You go somewhere, it is absolutely beautiful and stunning, but then you start looking at it and go, okay, let's talk about it. And of course, everybody else just wants to take pictures because it is absolutely spectacular. And you're trying to tell, well, those crossbeds over there are from giant sand dunes, right? This is a big erg. And anyways, all those fun things.
You tend to gravitate towards the science there.
God. So ready.
I'm telling you, we're just throwing up the softballs.
Usually James gets in like 2 an episode, but I think we're up to like 5 already.
Geology actually, because I talk with Jim Lehane sometimes, we do get our geology puns going. But the gravitate one is new. I just came up with that.
That's good.
Now.
I like it.
Going back to Big Thunder, you say it's based on Bryce Canyon. Does Bryce Canyon have caves like that, or is it just the overall hoodoo structure? And do they have big dinosaur bones?
One of my favorite places.
Yeah, first thing I'll say is clearly you're being a little bit bolder with your puns today, and that's good, James. There you go. There's my one contribution for you.
Oh, I like that. That was subtle.
I was going to say, who do you think you are?
Oh God.
So, Bryce Canyon's an amazing place. In fact, I was lucky enough to visit there this last summer and take some pictures that we were able to use as part of this conversation and share with folks as we were talking about this field trip. One thing, I'll take a step back and just talk about Disney for a second. So Disneyland's Big Thunder Mountain is unique because it's based on Bryce Canyon National Park. And I actually learned this from Dr. Jim, who's been on your program as well, is because of the color scheme of it. And that's something I didn't know either in all my research. I thought that was really neat because the color scheme matched what they were seeing in Disneyland better. So first question is, do we see caves at Bryce? We can have sinkholes. So Bryce is composed of limestone, but it's from ancient lakes. And these ancient lakes, of course, had limestones and mudstone, but we don't get formal caves and cave formations like you see in Big Thunder or like you think with the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? So you can get sinkholes associated with that lime, but you're not really developing major cave systems, at least that I know of so far. There wouldn't be dinosaurs. It's much younger. Dinosaurs were long extinct by at least 15 to 20 million years. I don't know, somewhere in there by the time that Bryce Canyon was being deposited. And so this ancient lake that existed in the middle of Utah during that time, there were no dinosaurs around. And actually, it's pretty fossil poor as far as the lake goes. They do find some gastropods and some other creatures there. The hoodoos are a fascinating story. It's really a story of erosion and weathering. And really mechanical weathering and erosion, right? The idea you have these freeze thaw actions, which give you these amazing spires. And that's one thing I think, again, back to what the Imagineers did for Disney and Big Thunders, they really captured that feel of Old West topography that is our imagination, right? When we think of the Old West, many folks including me growing up, I think of Monument Valley, I think of Zion, I think of Bryce. They understood that when they were building that. A great question. Yeah, the dinosaur bones are way out of time that are there. And it's actually one of the things we talked about during the field trip. Really cool to see. But yeah, they wouldn't have been around when Bryce was being deposited. They were long extinct.
I really wonder how many people like me, and I'm happy to admit it because I'm a Disney adult. I feel no shame about this, but I went to Bryce Canyon after going on Big Thunder probably a dozen times. So, I mean, I obviously know which one came first, but I definitely went and was like, oh, it looks like Big Thunder here. And same when I drove parts of Route 66, it's like, obviously I knew that Cars was sort of based on that, but like we certainly got to like one big expanse of a valley or whatever. And I was like, oh, like this is where that town is. Like that is the Cadillac Hills or whatever. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And I just sort of think it's funny to have gone in that order versus the other way around.
We did that too. My daughter got into Cars. We went to Cars Land. And then when we were in Arizona, she got excited about Route 66. And we actually planned to go to Seligman, which is the geographic location town of where Radiator Springs would be. Cool. And it's, right on Route 66 as it leads through some canyons and goes off of the main Interstate 40.
You're exactly right. And this is one of the reasons why we did this field trip as well, is because so many people get familiar with the pop culture that is Disney. You have Marvel now. Of course, you have Star Wars, which we've been talking about. Because of that, it's a great way to reach the next generation, or even just in general for general public consumption, to think about geosciences and how they relate back to other things people are familiar with, Cars and Pirates of the Caribbean and Star Wars, right? You can take all those concepts. So you're exactly right. And it's exactly the reason we were putting this field trip together, to help folks think about that link between those different things. So that's great.
Were there any attractions that like we wouldn't think of any sort of geology related to, but you're like, nope, we found some in here that connects?
Yeah, great question again. So one that was interesting that we talked about, and actually Dr. Jim and I were talking about this, was that Tiana's, right? So most people think Tiana's, it's in a swamp. But it's supposed to actually be, and Dr. Jim, again, brought this to my attention, it's actually supposed to be a salt dome, which we have all over here. So I live in the greater Houston area. And if you get to Louisiana, you have salt domes all over the place. That's where, Tabasco's made on one of these Avery Island salt domes. That's the idea and concept behind it. It's one of these geologic salt domes. That's what's going to create the topography for Tiana's. I thought that was really cool. The link there, I thought that was a fascinating thing to think about. The other one is at the Disneyland Resort. We went to I'm going to forget the actual name of it. It's where the kids play area where you're running through the redwoods and Sequoia. Yeah. If you go through there's some really interesting rock formations. Actually, they have real rocks in there too that make up where you sit. Most people are sitting on really cool rocks. Some we actually saw faults in. We saw some other really neat metamorphic and igneous features in. And they have a little cave in there too that goes to Brother Bear. The more you look, the more you recognize. Another one's Grizzly River Run. When you do Grizzly River Run, you're going around, that's the water. When you go around that, you actually go through a geothermal area, so a bunch of hot springs, right? And you also go by some beautiful columnar basalt. And so it's pretty neat to see how that was all incorporated in, because these are all things you see around California, right? And that's what they're pulling from. And really see a lot of that on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains by Mammoth Lakes, California area. If anybody goes that way, you can go to Hot Creek geologic area. You can go up to Devil's Post Pile and see these big columnar basalts there. It's all there, and it creates the experience subconsciously. And that's, again, the brilliance, I think, of what the Imagineers have done.
Yeah, because I was thinking even just like in the wharf area in California Adventure, there's, some rocks in the water that look like the ones you see off Monterey. And yeah, it really is sort of everywhere. I'm so excited to go back. I mean, I always love going to Disneyland, but now I'm definitely going to be even nerdier about it.
When you go to Galaxy's Edge, go walk around and look at the setting, right? Look at the quote unquote rocks. Take a look and see what you see there, and see if what we talked about today makes sense. I put that out there for everybody who's listening to this podcast. When you go to Disney World, you go to Disneyland, right? Go take a look and see if what we were talking about makes sense. And if not, look me up and let me know.
Did you do Smuggler's Run then too? Because that one you come in and out, because I run into the spires constantly because I'm very bad at steering video games. I realize you see more of Batu actually on that ride.
You do. And in fact, couldn't get everybody in at the same time, but we did ride that and talk about that. here's an extra thing for those of you, and maybe a lot of people know this. I didn't know this until we went on the ride, and they asked how many of us have done it before on Smuggler's Run, and all of us raised our hands. They said, would you like to do Wookiee mode or Chewbacca mode? Do you know there's a Chewbacca mode?
No,
I've heard of it. I didn't know they would offer it. I thought it was like a secret code.
It was the best version of Smuggler's Run I've ever been on, and it's all Chewie just yelling at you, right? Or talking to you. It all sounds like yelling to me because I'm crashing into things. I'm like, what's going on? But it is amazing if you get to do Chewie mode or Chewbacca mode. It was a really cool experience. So again, we had so much Disney magic during this whole experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you did Star Tours, which planets did you go to, and did you learn anything new about those planets? Because it's always a little different.
It is. Every time's different. We did make lots of comments, but because it's really hard, you almost need to write it a bunch of times and write little snippets about each place. How many planets do they have now? I can't even keep track of how many you can go to, right?
Because I've definitely done Naboo. I've definitely been in an asteroid field. I feel like you go pod racing sometimes on Tatooine. Hoth.
So the salt planet, right? With
Crate.
Yeah, we did that one. That was really cool. And that salt planet's a whole nother story, which is really cool. I know Dr. Jim again talked about that one of your earlier podcasts, which is really, really cool. I was going to say one thing back to Galaxy's Edge. I was interested. We looked all over it, actually looking for representations of faults in the park, of where there's been some kind of, because faults are very common on our planet, right? And some people are very much affected of them, like the West Coast with the San Andreas. We did notice going into, in fact, next time you go to Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland, going from Big Thunder Mountain that direction, they've recreated some amazing clinoforms, we call them dipping beds. And there's one area where they looks like try to put in a fault or did do a little bit of a fault there. The ones we got to Galaxy's Edge, we didn't notice any faults anymore, but lots of volcanic material probably buried a lot of that. And maybe it's just not active anymore. I'm not sure.
Did you go out to Tom Sawyer Island? Is that still a thing?
Yeah, so now it's the Pirate's Lair. So we did go out to Pirate's Lair and walk around. And again, they have some amazing cave decorations, right? Stalactites, stalagmites, you get a walk through. They also have a bunch of other kind of rocks, faux rocks you can walk through. One thing we realized during the course of this, and this is getting again to Disney geekdom, is that we noticed there was a distinct difference in the time that the rocks were made. So, of course, that island was, Walt personally worked on that island, right? It's one of the big things he worked on. And last big things he worked on, as I understand it. But if you look at the rocks there, next time you go to Disneyland, and I don't know if this is true for Disney World, all the early attractions, all the rocks, Pirates of the Caribbean, Tom Sawyer's Island, which is now the Pirate's Lair, Matterhorn, if you look at the rocks, they're all kind of gray with white and black speckles all over them, right? So they're all kind of made to look kind of like granite. Even the limestone has that same kind of coloring on it. You get into the 1970s where you get things like Big Thunder Mountain, of course, going forward all the way to Galaxy's Edge now. And you can see they've put a lot more detail and work into making the rocks actually look like rocks you go out and see out in nature.
I'm imagining that there's an Imagineering person whose specific job is like, I'm the rock specialist. You know, this is how we're going to paint rock surfaces. This is how we're going to texture them. Yeah. And then that just got me thinking about the Indiana Jones ride. You know, while it's more of an archaeological thing with the temple structures, but it's like, yeah, what kind of stone design went into that for like, what type of stone is it that you'd build if you were in kind of South Asia?
It's a good question. Actually, I don't know. I try to know everything, but it's tough. So if I remember walking through, right?
We should have asked our archaeologists.
Well, there's both caves. There's caves and the temple rows that you go through. So
the caves are going to be limestone, right? So that part I can tell you. But what they actually built, what the rock, quote unquote, supposed to be that they quarried to build the temple from, I'm actually not sure. But next time I go back, it's something I'm going to definitely put on my radar. So thank you for that. Yeah,
well, we should probably start wrapping up. I mean, all I can do is think of more examples too. I'm like, oh, there's that peak that looks like a grizzly bear. There's this, there's this. Yeah, we should probably start wrapping up.
I just wanted to ask about the Painted Desert. Do you know the history of the Painted Desert attraction there and how it's like in Big Thunder Mountain now?
The Painted Desert?
That was one of the original Disney attractions. I think it was where Big Thunder currently is.
It's Rainbow Ridge, and it was old stagecoach and pony ride area. In fact, the town that sits there as you come out of the ride, right? You go through the Rainbow Ridge town that's right there. Those wooden structures, the little mini ghost town. So those were, well, the original ones, as I understand it, were chewed up by termites. So those are recreations. Those were represented as what was used to be in that spot, right? And actually, when you have the rainbow drip pools, when you're going up through the cave with the stalagmites, my understanding is that's supposed to be a shout out to kind of that old attraction that used to be there. But then, of course, they redid it and built Big Thunder Mountain. So historically, they had an old desert landscape there again, based on the Old West. I've only seen some black and white footage and what I've seen like on shows behind the attraction when they talk about making some of these things. And I dug in a little bit, but there wasn't a whole lot that I could find on it out there. I would love to be able to go to like a Disney archive and check that out. I think that would be really fascinating.
Yeah,
Go to a
definitely.
Disney archive and go learn more about some of that history. So I should mention out there, so I do have a degree both in geology and history. Things like studying this is really exciting to me too. So I really like the Old West, especially because that's where both those worlds seem to intersect, which is really, really neat.
Well, we didn't talk too much about the Star Wars movies and all of that, but that's great. I sort of love this change of pace and really just talking about the parks. But still, tell us about your favorite Star Wars character.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So growing up, I mentioned Luke, but really, so Rey is my favorite character. And the reason for that is my daughter's nickname's been Rey since she was born. And so she was born before episode 7 came out, but her nickname was already Rey. And so I just happen to feel close to that name. But the one I'll tell you about, which I learned about, I decided to do a little digging. I wanted to find out if there's a geologist in the canon of Star Wars. And it turns out there is a geologist. His name is Jedi Michael Tandry. And he crash landed on a planet called Aurelian 2, where the Kunta people took up his teachings as a Jedi. He was never rescued there. And they actually have the Holy Order of the Geologist. So there's a deep cut for you. And it really comes from the old role-playing canon. So yeah, I decided I wanted to look that up and find out about it. So it turns out Jedis were geologists. So really, I'm a Jedi. So I'm just going to let you all know that.
I love that. That's great.
So he's my favorite character other than Rey is Michael Tandry. It's a Jedi geologist. How cool is that?
Wow, and that could just like a whole different thing of like lightsaber crystals. We could talk about that as a whole separate thing.
Kyber crystals, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll have to have you back to talk about kyber crystals. Yeah, we didn't
Are they
even think about
metamorphic
that.
or igneous?
Yeah. Cool. Well, if someone is interested in getting into your field, either, I guess, geology, paleontology, history, leading field trips in Disneyland, what would you recommend?
So how I got interested in geology in the first place was just being interested in rocks, which I think is how most geologists get there. But there are lots of clubs around in all kinds of different areas, gem and mineral clubs you can check out and see and learn a little bit more about rocks. Also, just taking a class somewhere, even a community college, going to some lectures, going to your natural history museum or a museum in the area is a great way to start learning about that and find out if that's a career or direction you want to go. There's lots of resources out there, lots of YouTube channels that you can go visit as well that talk about geology that are great out there. You can check out, including I have one called Earth and Time, 3 different words. You're welcome to check that out. I do history and geology videos out there for fun. I think a lot of folks I've ran into is just taking that first geology class, right? Whatever that is, community college, earth science class in high school or middle school, and then continuing to find that passion for wanting to learn about the world around you and continuing on.
Well, where can people find you online? You mentioned your video series. Is that on YouTube?
It's on YouTube. Yeah. So on YouTube and on Instagram called Earth and Time. You can find me on there. And this was a kind of a side project that spun off of stuff my daughter was doing. So my daughter started a YouTube channel called Ray and Dad when we were all locked up and we were just trying to, during the pandemic and trying to find out about how to keep in touch with family and what we were doing. And from that, a number of people reached out to me and said, you talk about history and geology all the time. Could you do more videos on that? So I started this channel, Earth and Time, doing that. I have a couple videos on stuff with Disney. I'll probably do more going forward. Like I actually went and toured all and looked for all the original LA locations for the Disney studios, which was really cool. Traveled all over the LA basin to find those. But yeah, so those are the 2 main places you find me on there. And I'm always happy to respond back and geek out on all kinds of stuff.
Awesome. We'll provide links to all of that. Thank you so much, Garrett. This was really fun to nerd out about, and I can't wait to go back to Disneyland and California Adventure and see it all with this more information.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Yep. Thank you, Garrett. And that concludes this episode of Star Warsologies. We'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Garrett Vice, and we'd like to thank all of you for listening.
If you're looking for all those links we talked about, check out our show notes page, which is available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And check out our YouTube channel, where we post all of our episodes, sometimes with related visuals from Star Wars.
Please remember to rate, subscribe, and like us on all of your favorite podcast streaming services, and definitely share us with your friends.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies, or you know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook where we post, which is called Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group. So join us there today.
No topic is off limits, even whether a marching band in Black Spire Outpost might have a batuba.
All right, we are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Talking Apes, the Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. And they also have a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
Thank you so much, and see you next time on Star Warsologies.
See you next year.
I was thinking that Wookiees probably do have some words you could understand. I mean, isn't there lahar?